Nashville, after midnight, 1510 on the AM dial. A voice came out of that signal that millions of black Americans trusted more than any other on the air. He played the records white stations wouldn't touch. He talked like the people listening. The signal reached 40 states, up into Canada, down into the Caribbean, 5 million people some nights, 10 on a good one. And unbeknownst to the listener, he was white. Nobody told the audience. But why? Before we begin, subscribe so you do not miss any of our lookbacks. In 1946, a few black college students brought a stack of records to a Nashville radio station. They handed them to the man on the night shift and asked him a question. Would you play some of our music? The man was Gene Nobles. He was white. He was from Hot Springs, Arkansas, and before radio, he had worked as a carnival barker and a bingo caller. He had the mouth for it. He insulted his listeners. He ran double entendres past the censors. He was an inveterate gambler who would vanish for days at a stretch and turn up at the racetrack. He was not a man on a mission. He was a man who needed something to play at 1 in the morning. So he played them, and the requests kept coming from a direction nobody at the station had thought about. Men were back from the war. Servicemen who had been shipped out of the rural South and stationed in other parts of the country had heard music out there they could not get at home, and they wanted it. There was demand. It had just never had anywhere to go. Nobles had a program called the Midnight Special, and he started building it around the records. Understand what that meant in Nashville in 1946. Across town, WSM was broadcasting the Grand Ole Opry to the whole American South. Country music, white performers, white audience, and a signal that made Nashville what it was. There was no major station anywhere in the South putting black music on the air. Not one. The station Nobles worked for was called WLAC. It was owned by an insurance company called Life and Casualty, which is where the call letters came from. There was not one black person on the payroll, and in a few years that station would be the most important thing in American black music, and almost nobody listening would know who was talking to them. There were really two versions of WLAC, and which one you got depended entirely on the hour. In daylight, it was an ordinary network affiliate. Columbia News at the top of the hour, soap operas in the afternoon, serials, quiz shows, the popular records everybody else was playing. If you tuned in at 2 in the afternoon, you would have heard the same thing you could hear anywhere in America. Then the sun went down, and the station became something with no equivalent anywhere in the country. Here is why that was possible. In 1942, the Federal Communications Commission picked a small number of American stations to carry a clear channel signal at night. 50,000 watts, and a frequency nobody else in the country was allowed to broadcast on. After dark, that signal stopped behaving like a local station. It bounced off the upper atmosphere and came down hundreds of miles away, clean enough to listen to. WLAC was one of them. To understand what that was worth, compare it to the stations that were actually built for black audiences. WDIA in Memphis, KFFA over in Helena, Arkansas. Both of them mattered enormously, and both of them started out running 250 watts. A signal like that covers a city and gives up. WLAC covered the South. It covered the eastern seaboard and the industrial Midwest. It went north across the Canadian border and south into the Caribbean, and on a strong night it reached as many as 40 states, somewhere between 5 and 15 million people, depending on the night and on whose count you trust. There was a man in a sharecropper's house in Mississippi with no record store within 50 miles, and a teenager in Ohio whose parents would have thrown the radio out a window, and a fisherman in Jamaica, all listening to the same four men in a studio in downtown Nashville. And what those men played was not background music. Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Lightnin' Hopkins, Memphis Minnie, Elmore James, Slim Harpo, Sister Rosetta Tharpe with an electric guitar in a church dress, Dorothy Love Coates. For an enormous number of people, that signal was the first time any of it had ever come out of a speaker in their house. Some of them sat there with a guitar in their lap trying to play along and could not work out what they were hearing because the men on those records were using tunings nobody had bothered to write down. A generation of players learned from teachers they never met hundreds of miles away in the dark. They were called the 50,000-watt quartet. Gene Nobles, Bill Allen, who went by Hoss, Herman Grizzard, and a former Shakespearean actor named John Richburg. Now, a radio station does not stay on the air because the music is good. It stays on the air because somebody is paying for it. And the story of how this got paid for is stranger than the music. There was a man named Randy Wood who ran a record shop in Gallatin, Tennessee, about 30 miles up the road. He sponsored Nobles, not the way sponsorship works now. There were no 30-second spots. A sponsor bought a block of the night, and the disc jockey sold the records on the air, live, in his own voice for as long as the block ran. Nobles told his listeners flatly that Randy's was the place to get rhythm and blues records. And here is the part that made it work. If you were black and living in the rural South in 1950, there was no store within reach that would sell you the music you had just heard. There might not be a record shop at all. If there was, it stocked what white customers bought. So you wrote down the address, put cash in an envelope, and mailed it to Gallatin, Tennessee. Randy's Record Shop became the largest mail-order record business in the United States, not the largest in the South, in the country. Every one of those envelopes came from somebody who heard about it on a 50,000-watt signal after midnight. It also decided who got hired. Bill Allen was in his middle 20s doing local radio in Gallatin, the same town as the shop. WLAC's sales manager introduced him to Randy Wood over Christmas of 1948. And Wood liked the voice enough to start asking that Allen be the one to fill in whenever Nobles disappeared to the track. That is how Hoss Allen got on the biggest signal in the South. A record store owner liked the sound of him. The other stores came in behind it. Ernie's Record Mart sponsored John Richburg, and his program was called Ernie's Record Parade. Buckley's Record Shop on Church Street sponsored Herman Grizzard. The disc jockeys built their playlists in league with the shops that paid them, which meant the records that got played were the records the shops could ship. An entire distribution system for Black American music built out of a radio signal and the United States Mail in a part of the country where the stores themselves were segregated, and it went further than anybody planned. The programming was popular enough in Jamaica that an early recording studio on the island took the name Randy's, after a record shop in Gallatin, Tennessee. If a voice from those years has stirred a memory, subscribe now and stay with me. The strangest part of this story is still ahead. By late 1947, Gene Nobles was being run into the ground. The mail was piling up, the block was getting longer, and one man could not hold the whole night by himself. So the station moved an announcer over from the news desk. His name was John Richburg. He had wanted to be a Shakespearean actor. It had not worked out, and he had gone into radio the way people did when the thing they actually wanted was closed to them. What he brought with him was a trained voice and a trained ear. He knew how to build a character and stay inside it, and that is exactly what he did. He took the name John R., which he said on the air, as a long, drawn-out John R. He gave himself a tagline, "Way Down South in Dixie." And he took the deep voice he had spent years training for the stage and put it somewhere no drama school would have sent him, into the speech patterns of Black America in the middle of the 20th century. He did it well enough that for decades most of the people listening to him assumed he was a black man. He never said he was. He never said he wasn't. Off the air, he was somebody else entirely. Quiet, formal, careful with words. Not the loud-mouthed hepcat you would expect from the man on the record. A shy and private person who did favors for people and did not much want to be thanked for them. On the air, the racial origins of John R. were simply never established. That was not an accident. That was the performance. The fan mail came in, and so many people spelled Richborg wrong that he gave up and shortened the whole thing to 2 characters. John R. Easier to write on an envelope. So why did nobody correct it? Start with the fact that nobody had to. Radio in 1950 was a voice in a dark room. There was no photograph, no station website, no way to check. A listener in rural Alabama had exactly one piece of evidence about who was talking to him, and it was the sound. There was also nothing to correct exactly. Richborg never claimed to be a black man. He built a voice and let people decide. That is a thinner defense than it sounds like, and it was also true. Then look at what correcting it would have cost. There was a record shop in Gallatin taking cash out of envelopes from people who trusted the man on the radio. There was an insurance company in Nashville watching a night shift turn into the most profitable thing it owned. Nobody in that building had a business reason to interrupt, and it was not simple in the other direction either. White listeners in the South wrote in to complain about the music itself, and the station kept playing it. The men doing it were not crusaders, and they were not innocent. They were 4 white Southerners who had found something that worked. In a country that had made it illegal for their audience to sit at the same lunch counter they did. That is the contradiction sitting under this whole story. In Nashville in 1955, a black listener and the man he listened to every night could not have eaten a sandwich in the same room. They could not have sat in the same section of a theater. The audience was writing him letters and mailing him money, and he could not have bought one of them a cup of coffee downtown. And every night at midnight the signal went up, and none of that applied for 4 hours. Richborg had one more habit that mattered more than the voice. He played dubs, acetates, and rough copies of records that were not out yet, that no other station in America had, sent to him directly by people who wanted him to hear them first. Think about what that meant for a small label with no money. You could not get a record into stores nationally. You could not buy advertising. What you could do was press one acetate, put it in the mail to Nashville, and hope that a man on the night shift liked it enough to play it once. If he did, you were on the air in 40 states by the following week. If you were a musician, John R. was the man who would play your record before anybody else would touch it. That is why they trusted him, not because of what they thought he was, because of what he did. In 1956, a rough recording arrived at the station from a young singer in Georgia nobody had heard of. The record was not finished. It was not officially released. It was a dub, sitting in a stack at a radio station, and by the ordinary rules of the business, it should have died right there. Hoss Allen was filling in for Nobles that night. He needed something nobody had heard. He put it on. The song was Please, Please, Please. The singer was James Brown. Allen kept it in rotation for 2 solid weeks. Nobles picked it up. Richborg picked it up. Between the 3 of them and 50,000 watts, a record that had not officially been released was playing across 40 states, and James Brown had the first chart hit of a career that would run for 50 years. That was the machine. A dub, a night shift, and a signal big enough that it did not matter what the rest of the industry thought. It happened again and again. Otis Redding, Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, Jackie Wilson. Fats Domino. For an enormous number of black artists in the 1950s and 60s, the first serious national airplay of their lives came out of that studio in Nashville, from men most of them had never met. There is a moment that tells you what that signal meant better than any of the numbers. A 17-year-old in Nashville named Jimmy Church was singing in a vocal group while he was still at Pearl High School. One night he heard his own voice come back at him out of the radio. He said later that if your record got played on WLAC, it meant you were heard everywhere. He went on to play with a young guitarist named Jimi Hendrix. Little Richard heard Tutti Frutti on the radio for the first time on WLAC. He jumped up, started screaming, and ran through the house shouting that it was his record. Buddy Guy was still in Louisiana, 2 years away from moving to Chicago, when he heard Maybelline by Chuck Berry come out of that signal for the first time. And by the middle of the 50s, something else was happening that nobody had planned. White teenagers had found the station, not in the South, everywhere. In Minnesota, a boy named Robert Zimmerman was listening to the Staple Singers on WLAC years before anybody called him Bob Dylan. In Florida, Greg Allman was hearing Howlin' Wolf. Up in Toronto, Robbie Robertson was pulling it in and taking down sounds that would end up defining a group called The Band. A blues guitarist named John Hammond grew up on McDougal Street in Manhattan and remembered that late at night, if the moon was bright, a good radio would pull in Nashville. Howlin' Wolf, Little Walter, Muddy Waters, Sonny Boy Williamson. Tracy Nelson grew up in a white, middle-class Norwegian family. She said the first time she heard that music, it was like something arriving from another planet, and she never got over it. Dwayne Allman, Johnny Winter, Charlie Daniels, Boz Scaggs, a whole generation of white musicians who built careers on blues they had no other way of hearing, all of them pointing back at the same station. They were listening under the covers with the volume down, partly for the music and partly because it was the most forbidden thing available in the house. Their parents thought it was noise. Some of their parents thought it was worse than noise. That was the appeal. One of those listeners was a kid named Bob Smith, who would grow up to call himself Wolfman Jack. He made the trip to Nashville to meet Rich Borg in person. He took the voice, the delivery, the whole approach, and built a career on it. Alan Freed did the same thing up in Cleveland and New York. The street talk that made Freed famous, the thing people still associate with the birth of rock and roll, was a style that came down from a failed Shakespearean actor working the graveyard shift in Tennessee. In March of 1985, John Richborg was dying of cancer, and Hoss Allen put together a benefit concert for him at the Opry House. The people who came to play were Tony Joe White, Art Neville, Bobby Jones, Aaron Neville, men whose careers had been helped by a voice on the radio decades earlier. They came to Nashville and stood on a stage for the man who had played their records when nobody else would. Richborg died the following February at 75. He had spent the last part of his life managing and producing artists, still working the same side of the business, still doing favors he did not talk about. Now, here is the part of the story that does not resolve cleanly. Randy Wood, the man with the record shop in Gallatin, had built the largest mail-order record business in the country by selling rhythm and blues to black listeners who could not buy it anywhere else. In 1950, he took that money and started a record label. He called it Dot, and the artist who made Dot Records into a national business was a clean-cut young singer named Pat Boone. He was born in Jacksonville, Florida, but his family moved when he was 2 years old, and the city they moved to was Nashville. He grew up there. He went to high school there. As a teenager, he hosted a talent show on Nashville radio. The man whose records would compete with everything WLAC was breaking had grown up inside the range of the same signal. Pat Boone's method was simple. He took songs by black artists and recorded them again, smoother, softer, with the edges filed off for a white audience that would not buy the originals. Ain't That a Shame? And Tutti Frutti, the same song Little Richard had run screaming through his own house about when he heard it come out of a radio in the middle of the night. Those records sold enormously, and every one of them competed directly against the record it was copied from. Alan Freed would not play them. He refused white cover versions on principle, and Pat Boone's Tutti Frutti was exactly the kind of record he meant. So, follow the money all the way through. Black listeners in the rural South mailed cash to a store in Tennessee to buy the music white radio would not play. That cash built a record label. That record label made its fortune selling white copies of black songs to the audience that had been avoiding the originals. The same pipeline ran both ways, and it paid better in the second direction. Randy Wood did nothing illegal and nothing unusual. He saw what sold, and he sold it. That is the whole point. The pipeline was never built to lift anybody. It was built to move product, and it moved product in whatever direction paid, and for a while the direction that paid was black music going to black listeners who had no other way to get it. When the money pointed the other way, it went the other way. The rest of it came slowly. In December of 1951, a station called WSOK went on the air in Nashville as one of the first full-time all-black formatted stations in the country. It was still white-owned. But the announcers were black, and the programs had names like Cook's Blues and Peace in the Valley. WLAC itself did not hire a full-time black announcer until years into the run. His name was Don Whitehead, and there is a photograph of the WLAC jocks from 1968 where the 4 white men are seated, and Don Whitehead is standing behind them. 22 years after a few college students walked in with a stack of records. Nobles retired in 1972 and died in Nashville in 1989. Hoss Allen kept going the longest. Into the 1980s, he was still programming hard gospel, the Caravans and the Sewanee Quintet, the quartet music that nearly every soul singer in America had come up out of, long after the rest of it had been dismantled. In 1994, the Blues Foundation put all 3 of them into the Blues Hall of Fame together. Not the broadcasting industry, the music community they had spent their lives playing. 5 to 10 in Nashville is a talk station now. Same frequency, same tower, same 50,000 watts after dark. Nobody on it plays records. So the answer to why nobody told the audience is that there was never a moment when telling them would have helped anyone in that building, and by the time it would not have mattered, the thing was already finished. What is left is the arithmetic. 4 white men in a segregated southern city playing music their own neighbors called noise, to an audience that spent 30 years assuming they were somebody else and putting artists on the air that the rest of American radio had decided did not exist. They did not do it to be good. They did it because it worked, and because the sun went down every night and something had to go out over the signal. It just happened to be the most important thing anybody in Nashville did with a radio. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe and watch the next video above.